Aled, perhaps we can start by you sketching out where you were with your doctoral research when you first encountered Raymond Williams.
Well, I mean, I actually encountered Raymond Williams a bit before my doctoral research, but I think my first sort of the first place where I uncovered Raymond Williams was actually I bought a copy of Border Country from the National Museum in Cardiff, and then stowed it away for a few years before reading it. But yeah, Border Country was my entry point to Raymond Williams as somebody that I was particularly enthusiastic about. And I think probably what helped me was that the landscape and the place that he was writing about in Border Country was not far from where I grew up, in Cullean, near to Newport. So that was kind of an entry point for me into Raymond Williams. And also just the other thing is that his whole concept of being on the border is probably something that anybody who was brought up in South East Wales would appreciate, and especially me having a definitely English father and a mother whose parents are both in North Wales, that she had a triangular connection between North, South Wales and England as well.
Tell us a little bit about your research into Cullean, your delving into the place.
Okay, so I was brought up in Cullean, on the edge of Newport. I was born in 1978, so I grew up there in the 80s. And like I just said, my parents came from other parts of the world, other parts of the UK, and kind of, I think my father arrived in that place with he was an English teacher, and he went on to become the head of English at Cullean School. But he always said to me that he remembered the first time when he came over the hill and down into, you know, the village, and, you know, with the setting on the River Usk and the stone walls and the Roman remains. And I think that kind of stayed with him through his life, that Cullean was this kind of romantic place, and which just so happened to have a secondary modern comprehensive school that had been built there in the 60s, which, you know, gave him his job, and then eventually quickly led to me and my brother being born. And I think my brother and I were both inspired by the place in different ways, really. I mean, I'll come back to myself later on, but my brother ended up studying history at Oxford, and I think that was partly based on the amount of history that was immediately next to us as we grew up in that place. And there were always lots of kind of cultural events, and, you know, we were dressing up as soldiers and all sorts of stuff like that. And in the 80s as well, that's when the Roman Baths Museum opened. So there's a big focus on, and there's some other notable characters in the village in the 80s, Russell Rees in particular, who set up the Frome Arts Centre. So yeah, I think there was, and you know, there's gone on to be an arts festival there, and a particularly strong literary festival as well. So always lots of sort of creative and thoughtful ways to interpreting not just the Roman history, but also kind of ideas of whether Camelot was actually existing in that place, and also Arthur Machen, who is a big inspiration for my work as well. He was born there also.
So the place was inspiring enough for both you and your brother Tom, but for you in particular, to take it as the subject for your PhD. Sketch out where you were when you started that, because your father plays into that story as well.
Yeah, sure. So I started my PhD in 2016, and actually my PhD is in kind of the health sciences, so it's to do with aging. And I wasn't originally going to focus on Cullean because, you know, one of the first rules of social science is don't sort of research something which is too close to home, and mostly it's because people think you'll be a bit biased. But then in my case, there was another reason, which was about sort of being emotionally too close to where you come from. And so in 2016, my dad had a cancer diagnosis, and it was not going to be curable. So yeah, he died in 2018 in June, and I took a year out from my PhD because there's the pressure of having to look after him. And in that time, I think I read a lot. I probably read Border Country for the first time actually in that period between sort of late 2017 and the middle of 2018. And I also wrote, I'm trying to summarize my feelings. I'd write short poetry, short verse, mostly to myself. Sometimes I shared with other people, but and I think also I did kind of relax into maybe the upbringing that I'd had of a house full of books and foreign holidays that were always kind of inspired by place and inspired by maybe, yeah, I think probably Dad's kind of romantic sort of ideas and the ways that he could sort of visualize things which weren't actually there, if that makes sense. Albeit Dad never really got into Mackin. I'm pretty sure he never, but certainly one of Dad's big heroes was Thomas Hardy, and Dad's master's at Cardiff was about the poetry of Thomas Hardy. So I always knew that Hardy was a big inspiration for both my dad and also my grandma as well. And then, yeah, so I also read The Country and the City, and that helped me to stitch a lot of different things together, because Raymond Williams was also massively inspired by the way that Thomas Hardy wrote, or rather, from my perspective, the way that he took the opportunity to write about his times, and you know, he played that plied rather that sort of insider outsider line, which I took as a metaphor for how I should do my PhD research, as both an insider and an outsider, and to do something creative rather than to do something overly scientific.
So you abandoned some of the precepts of social science and stopped being on the outside and went on to the inside. And for you, it became, therefore, in part, an emotional journey. It was as much about understanding your father and examining the relationship between the two of you. And therefore, it's little wonder that reading Border Country, which is precisely about that subject, must have been key for you in that period.
Yeah, I think that I also read quite a bit of D.H. Lawrence as well, which perhaps features both fathers and mothers, but sometimes a bit more mothers. Yeah, I think, going back to what I was saying earlier on, that you can, as a social scientist, then you also have to think about your emotional relationship with the research, and the ethical side of social science is really critical. You can't do any social science research without actually having a methodology and being clear about about ethics. So in my ethical application, I did also have to say that doing my actual research, which started in 2019, so this was maybe a year after Dad had died, I had to be kind to myself as well. So I couldn't do something which would actually be cause me emotional distress, which in some ways is quite helpful, and certainly having your guidance was really important there as well, John.
So you'd read Border Country, you'd read The Country and the City, but let's home in for a moment on Williams's ideas about structures of feeling. Now, his ideas about structures of feeling appeal to many people, in part because they're not definitional. You can interpret them in a way that suits yourself, in a sense. But for you in particular, the whole idea of structures of feeling did have a very special resonance. So perhaps you'd like to share how Williams's ideas percolated into and fed into your own thinking at the time.
Sure. So one of the things that I decided to do for my work was to have a series of interviews I like to do walking interviews. And a walking interview is where you interview the other person and the interviewee. The interview actually leads you through their story, but using geography as the way of telling the story. It works in two ways. So the first way is actually to go on a walk with somebody and then to record that, the conversation that you have. And the other thing that I did was what's called a walk of the mind, which is using geography as a way of actually like a walk of the mind where you would both concentrate on a space or concentrate on a map and just imagine, literally just close your eyes and imagine that walking through that space. And so both methods revealed loads of really interesting stories from people. And so, like I said, it's about aging. So I was interested in people who were sort of in the 65 and above age category. And also one of the interesting things about Culzean is that it has the highest sort of proportion of people over 65 in the Newport City Council area. So part of my remit was to understand why. And this comes onto the structure of feeling, because part of what my research, at least the creative side of it, tried to achieve was to understand to go back sort of 65 years and to understand the time and place that people started to come to Culzean. So in November 2019, I was planning an event, a public event, and one of the people that I worked with is Marega, who's part of our talk today as well. And so the thing was about trying to sort of set the context of how a place came into being, in effect, in that sort of post-war era. I think it was 1965 or something that the school was built. But there's a bigger story about houses being built, and also the story of the steelworks in Newport and Llanwern. So from my interviews, I started to find that many people have come from places like Ebbw Vale, Bryn Mawr, Beaufort. They're all much higher up the valleys from Newport, and they're kind of the older industrial settlements of South Wales. But they're also related to the border country story, because where Williams came from, Pandy is just to the east of the South Wales coalfield, but it had that kind of strong relationship with the coalfield and the ironworks. And I think the trains going through the village were loaded up with coal, and they were intricately connected with his life. So what I wanted to do really was to try and find a unifying concept which allowed us to use an event to kind of present and develop a structured feeling which related to that particular time and place. So actually dipping back into things like the country and the city and border country, there's some really important lines from Williams. For example, he says in the introduction to the country and the city that before I had read any descriptions and interpretations of the changes and variations of settlements and ways of life, I saw them on the ground and working in unforgettable clarity. And indeed, the story of border country is about a village which is effectively Pandy, and he starts to talk about how that place changes. So he talks about the life of the country and cities moving in present, moving in time through history of the family and the people, moving in feelings and ideas through a network of relationships and decisions. And then I'm going to give you the definition of structures of feeling. And this comes from the Oxford University Press. So they say structure of feeling refers to different ways of thinking vying to emerge at any one time in history. It appears in the gaps between the official discourse of policy and regulations, the popular response to official discourse, and its appropriation of literary and other cultural texts. And Williams uses the term feeling rather than thought signal that what is at stake may not yet be articulated in a fully worked out form, but has rather to be inferred by reading between the lines. If the term is vague, it is because it is used to name something that can only really be regarded as a trajectory. And I think that's important, that the structured feeling captures a moment in time, and that kind of space between, society keeps on changing. And that's certainly one of the things that I learned from my research, that you can't quite pin down a place and a time. It's like the Roman remains in Caerleon. They represent sort of 2,000 years ago. You can see the artifacts in the baths, but it's society has moved on since then. I don't know, what do you think about the concept, John?
Well, I like the idea that not only are they feelings, but they're often things like intuition, the things you can't explain. And certainly in border country, he's registering what is happening in the area, but also he's intimating what might also happen. It's a sort of hunch. So this book comes out in the 1960s, and it's on the cusp of those huge changes that Dr. Beeching brought about, closing the branch lines, closing the stations, and so on. And Williams was a very bright man, and he'd have known that even if the politicians were hiding away their full intentions, that the great era of the railways, the thing which had almost defined the Industrial Revolution, the thing that had actually powered the claiming of the world by the British Empire, that we were at the fag end of that, and that in a very small way, in a very local way, the railways that he had known and which feed into the story of border country were about to, if not disappear, but to certainly be incredibly emasculated. And if you think about what Abergavenny was like at the time when Williams was growing up. So Pandy was just down the line from a town which had 3 railway stations. The London and Northwestern Railways had 3 stations in Abergavenny. So they had Junction Station, Brecon Road, and then the Great Western Railway had Monmouth Road. The locomotive sheds in Abergavenny were big enough to take 100 locomotive engines. But the thing that really marks out for me, the way that railway feeds into his life and into the story, is that in the 1920s, about 1,000 people, about 1,000 men worked in Abergavenny. If you then add in the families of those men, about 1/3 of the population of Abergavenny, which then had 12,000 people living there, worked on the railways. And this, in effect, was a huge community. It was a community of politically astute and aware people who were arranged around unionism, but they were also arranged around platforms. There were little communities that looked after each and every station platform. There were the men in the locomotive sheds. There were the men who kept the permanent way, the railway lines clear, and so on. So this was a sort of banding together, an artificial way. And for me, because I am the son of a railwayman, my uncle was a railwayman, I remember those days simply because even after Beeching, an awful lot of people worked there. There was a community of railwaymen. And I think that that's one of the things that you see in Williams, and you see it in your work, that it actually looks at what things happen, what things happen to bring people together. The creation of a street in Caerleon creates a community. Put 3 or 4 streets together and they become a little area which is definitional. It's not quite like the next area. It has different gates, it has different pillars. And certainly when we walked around there, you could see that story played out as things like pride, because people said, oh, that thing happened here, yeah? Or I built that.
Yeah, so interpreting all of that, there's also quite a good line, I think, from from the last version of Border Country, the Library of Wales version, and Di Smith says that the novel does what no history and little fiction has achieved. It shows the inescapable intertwining of individuals' lives and social conditions in the fluidity of lived experience that we all share. And I think actually this, coming back to fluidity and movement, is really important, because so the story of Caerleon, it has its sort of Roman foundations. It's got, we also did a walk in July 2019 where we took a group of 40 people up to the hill fort, and that was partly inspired by Arthur Machen and the Hill of Dreams. But it's kind of when you start to see the number of semi-detached houses, and particularly the kind of the urban, well, you could call it an urban sprawl, to use another kind of sense of movement, that actually the place really expanded in that post-war era. And in fact, I ended up calling my thesis Pursuing the Post-War Dream, because it really was about seeing the place for what was on the ground. And coming back to my own biography, I didn't realize so much that the story of this place and the reason why the comprehensive school was there, and therefore the reason why my father came to the place, was because it supported this much bigger story of industrial sort of renovation, industrial change in what was then called the County of Monmouthshire. And so I started to dig into this story because it came out from the walking interviews and the different events that we put together. And then on the South Wales Argus website, there was an article which linked to a little film, which was a sort of early 60s film. It was kind of quite formal, and it was actually made by Monmouthshire Council, as was. And they said, you know, regardless of all of the work that was put in to build this massive steelworks, which initially employed over 10,000 people, it said, you know, like us, we, the council, we built hundreds of miles of roads, we built schools, but also significantly, they built lots and lots of council houses to supply the, you know, the demand for accommodation. And this kind of big story of movement became quite apparent to me. So I'm a child of the 80s, and in effect, the community had been built in the 60s and 70s, and then my generation was kind of the generation built into this new, let's call it a structure of feeling, which was people working in the steel industry. And it wasn't just Clanwern, the British Steel factory. There were also lots and lots of other little businesses. There was a Pirelli factory in Newport, the Lucas brake factory up in Cwmbran, and it kind of all felt, now I think about it, it was all so obvious, you know, that was the world that was created in the late 50s and early 60s as something which they thought was going to last for a long time. As it's proven, it didn't last very long. And the 80s was a time when lots of jobs were lost at the steelworks. And then bit by bit, nearly all of these businesses have actually left the local area. And that's, so in a way, you could forget how significant it was, this whole movement of people. And in a bit, we'll kind of explore the movement in a more literal sense, in a more creative sense as well. So, go on, John.
So to sketch out the geography, though, you have Llanwern Steelworks being built on marshy ground east of Newport. And in order to reclaim that marshy ground, they had to fill in the land. And one of the most useful building materials they could bring was actually byproduct from mining. And of course, the mining was up the riven gulches of the southeast valleys, as the novelist Gwyn Thomas called them. And they had to be transported then down older roads which weren't actually designed to take heavy transport. And certainly as they came through Caerleon, they were shearing away the sides of the road in a way which is exactly the same as happens in border country, where when they opened up the little factory to produce soft fruit or whatever, the lorries going there are clearing away the primrose covered sides of the roads and so on. So it did actually have an effect of bringing industry into what had, up until the building of all these council houses, been a quiet place on a meandering bend of the river, and it brought about change. It was a very visible sign of industry passing through and connecting.
Yeah, so some really quite fascinating things came out of different interviews, and because I wanted them to be led by the interviewee, I wasn't sort of asking them too many direct questions. I was letting the kind of space speak for itself. So there was a particularly interesting interview where somebody talked about a car that had crashed through her back garden, and Marega interpreted that on the event we did in the summer of 2019. And that kind of captured the drama of how, you know, even in the 60s, the car was still relatively new and people didn't really know how to drive them very well. They didn't have great brakes. And so it was the going back to the structure of feeling idea. It's kind of trying to put yourself in that time and place, and particularly for me as somebody who wasn't alive then, and for quite a lot of other people, it just reminds you of that kind of, you know, for example, we're in a pandemic now and we know roughly how that feels, but in time it'll be quite hard to convey how that changed our daily lives. And so the car was a significant thing which changed daily lives. And it came up time and again in the interviews, in terms of facilitating people actually, you know, when people worked at the steelworks in Ebbw Vale, which effectively weren't replaced, they came, you know, it's about 20-ish miles down to Newport. But I mean, culturally, it's a massive change. And so the cultural change was that people were able to live in a semi-detached house, and they also they had to rely more on the car as a way of getting to work than they did before. You know, in the past, people would live within a mile or so of the factory or the coal mine or wherever, and there'd be service buses to take people to work. People would walk to work as well. And there was that kind of proximity. And I remember one of the people I interviewed who was born roughly the same time as Williams, actually, and he's nearly 100 now. He talked about when he left. He lived in Bryn Mawr at the time, but he'd lived in Bryn Mawr and Beaufort and around Ebbw Vale. And he said that the community was kind of blown apart when people left those tight valleys locations to come and live in Caerleon, where they had sort of indoor bathrooms and all sorts of different things, and like society was shaken up to a large degree. And this comes back to this idea of fluidity and movement. But the main point that I wanted to convey about our creative response to Williams was this event in November 2019. So it was partly an indoor event and partly an outdoor event where we were walking. So the first sort of 40 minutes or so was this indoor event. And at the end of this, I'll share a video clip of it. It's a 3-minute video. But Marega and I wanted to find a way of capturing that time and place. And John started talking about the shale. So the shale came from places like the British, which is in Tallawayne, up the valley from Pontypool going up towards Blaenavon. And it turns out that there were these shale lorries which actually brought all of the material down to the marshlands in Llanwern on the eastern side of Newport to build the foundations of the steelworks. And one of the people I interviewed, he said, you know, did you know about these shale lorries? And I had no idea about these shale lorries. And he told me about how they were driven by maniacs and how they kind of harassed the locals. And back in the late 50s, early 60s, there was a bridge over the River Usk in Caerleon. There was a bridge, the main town bridge in Newport, and then there was also the transporter bridge. So the means of actually crossing the Usk were pretty limited. This was before the motorway was complete. And so all of this material was funneled down to a fairly small space. So what I asked Marega to do was to interpret the story, and we also had like an interesting little nugget, which made the story a little bit more interesting. And I'm just going to describe it in words now and not give away the actual story. But she had a little toy lorry, which is actually one of my childhood toys, a tipper truck. And in that truck, there were these little stones to kind of signify the shale. And she, in this room of, I think, yeah, there were about 40 of us in the community hub on Lodge Hill in Caerleon. And I'd lined up the whole story of my research and the stories that started to appear and related it back to the Romans and all that type of stuff. And then Marega put on a 3-minute song, which was Big Spender by Shirley Bassey. So in the time that it took to get to the end of Big Spender, she got out this paper roadway, and it was held by the first person, and then most people in the room actually had a piece of this ticker tape in their hands. And then I think probably with about 20 seconds to spare, she pushed the lorry all the way along the road, and then she got to the very end of the line and tipped the stones into the hat of the lady who's at the end of the line. And that's when Big Spender stopped. And we hadn't really introduced the story, and we said, so what does all this mean? And the people who were alive at that time, they said, the show lorries. And it sparked quite an amazing response, really. And because we hadn't sort of tried to plant the idea in people's heads, we allowed them to try and sort of work it out for themselves. And Marega had actually worked the room to a degree in terms of just asking people to get from their heads into their bodies. And she often says to me that she holds knowledge in her body as much as other people hold knowledge in their minds. And now I think about it, even the song Big Spender has got deeper resonance because there was a lot of money being spent by the state to build the steelworks and to build these new houses. And the connection to Shirley Bassey, John,
was that she owned some shale lorries and had been a big spender herself. I think almost as significantly for me as the resonance of the song Big Spender was something else that happened when you allowed people to converse and to discover more about their shared memories, was that there was actually a song, a ballad written about Dan, who drove one of the shale lorries. And listening to people trying to remember the different verses was itself a lovely moment, because what you had done was to trigger not only a shared memory, but also go into specific things. Oh yes, there was that song. And then to hear that song being disinterred from the memory banks was just a lovely, dare I say, magical moment.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was definitely a bit of a punt on what could work and what might not work as well. And also I wasn't really sure what Marega was going to do either. So we've worked together over the past few years, and for me, as let's say I was kind of the social scientist and she was very much the artist, to sort of pass an idea from one person to the other and to trust the other person to just do something brilliant was really fruitful as well. And go on, John.
But they also did their own things which were brilliant, because the community itself actually produced an array of extraordinary cakes. And then when we walked around, we started off with you as the expert, let's say. You were someone who didn't have a label, but it was, I am the expert, I've helped to make this happen. And then gradually they took over ownership because they knew things that you didn't know.
Yeah.
And they went from being initially a group of people who had been thrown together to being pilgrims, like the Chaucerian pilgrims who exchanged tales in the Canterbury Tales. We walked around different periods of the council estate and they pointed out things, and then you stepped back. And then by the time we were back again in the little community space, it had deepened the sense of community. And I think it's that I'd like to encourage you to talk about next, but I'm going to do it with a prompt, really. It's from an unpublished work by Raymond Williams. And it's from what he called Border Village. It was written in 1957. It is one of the many variant versions of what he tried to write, which finally manifested itself in Border Country in 1960. And what he's doing is describing a localized Steddfod in Abergavenny. The first time I read it, I broke down because it was so deeply involved with the whole business of community and community memory. Because when I was growing up, there would be people, or usually a person in a village or town, who was the custodian of memory. He or she would remember who belonged to everybody else. And that's what Williams describes when he tells of an old man inviting a young girl up onto the stage. Eleanor Watkins, come up, Eleanor. Eleanor Watkins, Tremaine. Tremaine, yes. Where the White Barn. The White Barn stands by the bend of the river. Eleanor, yes. Eleanor, daughter of Mary, who was Mary Rees when she went to marry John Watkins, the son of my very old friend, John Watkins the Bridge. Mary herself, I remember. Mary with red hair, red to her shoulders, singing here where I am standing, 11 years old. And this is Eleanor, her daughter. Mary Rees, Mary Watkins, Eleanor Watkins Tremaine. Come up, Eleanor. Come up by this old man who remembers your mother coming to him. This ritual of identification and memory meant almost everything to the silent and apparently unresponsive listeners. There was the meaning of life every time. Mary had sung and her daughter Eleanor was singing. Eleanor with red hair to her shoulders, standing by the extraordinary Illtyd Morgan Adara. And in that you have all the different layers of memory combining the underlining of relationships. And of course, Border Country is arranged around that structure, isn't it? It's about the homecoming of a son, a university lecturer, Matthew, to see his ailing father. But it's also a book which explains how one of the great shudders in industrial history happened in 1926, the Great Strike and so on, and how that affected not just the miners, but the people in the next valley over, if you like, who were working on the railways. And I'm sure that sense of community so deeply there in Williams, who did, of course, write a series of books, The People of the Black Mountains. The people were important. And in your work, what you were doing was actually saying, yeah, there were decisions made. People built these places, people lived there, and people lived there before you yourselves moved in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the actual sort of life, the period in which Raymond Williams lived was really important because, he grew up in that era of the railway. And also he grew up in the era of the kind of the Great Strike, and also, the Depression. And one of the things I learned from interviewing people who were in their 90s was that South Wales in the 20s, it was a very hard existence. And there was one person who shared a story of their father who worked at a little railway station called Treville, which is on the line from Abergavenny and then down to Dowlights, the heads of the Valleys Railway. And he said that his father had a job which was effectively printing tickets and also kind of changing the signals and all sorts of stuff. It's a very small station compared to Pandy, but he said that his father wore a uniform and therefore kind of got the same respect in the village that a policeman would have got. And it's sort of, you understand that how fundamentally difficult life had been in South Wales in that period between the end of the First World War and I guess the Second World War. And so that's the reason why this big operation to make a new modern steelworks in Newport, a steelworks which is better connected to the communications and a cluster of other metal related businesses. You can see why there was such a grand vision and also how that connected into good housing and new schools and all sorts of other things. It really was that post-war dream, and maybe it's specific to Southeast Wales and maybe some other places in the UK as well. If you like, I used the work of Raymond Williams and also D.H. Lawrence and also Hardy before that, and my grandmother's stories as well about growing up in World War II as to kind of put together that kind of continuum of how life had changed and that kind of fluidity. And the shell lorries really resonated because I went to school 100 meters away from where we did the event in 2019, and I remember learning about the Chartists. I remember learning about the Romans for sure, but we never really learned about the reason why this place being that estate on the hill that was very much started by the council and very much connected to that bigger vision. We never really learned about that. And some of the responses from the event were, let's stop looking at these big histories and let's actually start looking at the more of the social history, and that. So I think that's what we achieved by using a creative approach and a non kind of didactic approach. It was underpinned by just walking around a place and then giving that space of kind of generosity. When you're outside, you break down the sort of the formal sort of educational space where generally you have the teacher or whoever at the front, and then everybody else is facing them, and they can't really see each other and they can't communicate with each other so well. So the forum of being outside is a great way of allowing people to kind of build up that story. And I'm certain that I never would have, I knew nothing about the shell lorries. I barely even really understood how significant the steelworks have been to the story of Culzean and to Newport as well. And putting my social scientist hat back on, I realized that the reason why there were so many people 65 and above was because they had come to this place when it was a new place. And I think people just decided that that's where they wanted to stay for the rest of their lives. They wanted to stay in this place where they could have a semi-detached house and where they could drive their car, and where you have got access to jobs and that kind of pleasant environment, which connects back to what my dad found, which is a kind of a historic village on the river with a nice setting looking over to Wentwood and the places which inspired Arthur Mack and others. And it does present itself as a place that you'd want to stay for the rest of your life, but it wouldn't be accessible, it wouldn't be possible if the place hadn't developed in that post-war era. And it was good to kind of tap into that deeper story, and a story which definitely isn't in the history books.
One of the things that happened when we first met really was we did the walk. We caught the train to Newport, and then we walked to Caerleon. And in doing that, and seeing the geography of your childhood home, where the house was situated, how it related to the river, what was behind it, the little road that snaked through, which had become increasingly busy as people used it as a shortcut. That was a very excellent way to get to know someone. And in your own research then, you used walking, both physically and in these walks of the mind, as triggers. Now, psychogeography was at play somewhere, but often when we think of psychogeography, it's about how geography impacts emotionally or in other ways on the individual. And it's often about the individual walking around an urban space by himself. But what you were doing here was actually having groups of people exploring their own psychogeographies in companionship, sometimes stopping for break, and you would start to talk to the next person and find out their little mini biographies. So really that whole technique of walking, quite apart from then bringing in an element of performance in Marega's contributions, was something which really did empower you. It was a very rich tool.
Yeah, there are different sort of definitions of psychogeography, but so what you're talking about, the individual walking around, the kind of flaneur character, is one small element of the broader psychogeographic practice. But one of the things which I particularly thought about a lot was the Situationists, and they were they were around in the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, and their mission really was to explore the deeper sort of emotional connections that we have to space, led by Guy Debord and others. And they one of their first rules was that you would never go out on your own. You'd definitely go in a group, 2, 3 at least people. So their approach to psychogeography was always that it was a group exercise, and that you would you'd literally throw a dice, and that decides which way you go. Part of their whole approach was to let go of the self as you explore space. And modern writers such as Rebecca Solnit, she theorizes about how we should do it, and she's got an excellent book called Wanderlust. But so reading a bit more into the Situationists, they were also kind of opposed to this urban sprawl. They were opposed to the erasure of places that had deeper meaning. They were very much focused on Paris and I guess other parts of France. And the French did much like we did really in the UK in terms of building motorways and building out of town suburban sprawls. And so again, that kind of captures that time and place. And a big part of what the Situationists did was to work with artists, and that's why Marega was critical to the work, because she helped to kind of break up the flow and helped to kind of find different directions. And so the first public walk that we did for this project was in July 2019, and the route was from the Priory Hotel, which is next door to the house where Machen was born. So we're talking about Raymond Williams, but also Arthur Machen was really important to my journey as well. And so he wrote this book called The Hill of Dreams, which may or may not have been about the hill, Lodge Hill, which is where the housing estates were built. And so we created this route, which was as close as possible along the path which existed in the late 1880s, early 1890s, when I imagined that Machen would have actually been researching the book, because it was finished in the 1890s, published a bit later than that. But it's kind of letting go of your sort of conscious desires and following something which is deeper. And I think that's also what Williams does as well. He he tries to kind of find that kind of deeper groove, that sort of that connection which is below consciousness, and that's also, you know, psychogeography tries to do one thing. It is to let go of that top level of this is what I want to do, and it does allow you to go from your mind down into your body, exactly as Morega says, that, you know, you have to try and, well, you can try and find a way for the body and the mind to meet, or you can just let yourself into your body, and sometimes the walk your legs will take you somewhere where your mind doesn't necessarily want to go. And also, I'm particularly interested in sort of physically going to a location, and you can't always predict what that's going to make you feel like. You can't always predict what that will unlock. And things like the Shirley Bassey and the shell lorries, that was unlocked by a walk of the mind, when one of the interviews talks about how he used to roam about as a teenager. And it, you know, it never would have come about unless he'd been following that line of his teenage roaming. Or the story about the car, how the car crashed through the back garden, that wouldn't have come about unless we actually had revisited that site and seen, you know, how that could have happened.
Those connections between body and mind and place happen in Raymond Williams when people are walking. And here's a description from Border Country, which I broke no argument is the finest novel written in Wales in the 20th century. And this is where Harry and Ellen Price are walking up the hills, just as you were walking up Lodge Hill in Caerleon. This is them actually claiming the higher land. Between road and railway, in its curving course ran the Honddy, the Black Water. On east of the road ran the grassed embankment of the old tram road, with a few overgrown stone quarries near its line. The directions coincided, and Harry, as he walked, seemed to relax and settle. Walking the road in the October evening, they felt on their faces their own country. The huddled farmhouses with their dirty yards, the dogs under the weed-growing walls, the cattle-marked crossing from the sloping field under the orchard, the long fields in the line of the valley where the cattle pastured, the turned red earth of the small, thickly hedged ploughland, the brooks, alder-lined, curved and meeting, the bracken-heaped tussocky fields up the mountain, where the sheep were scattered and the wood-shaded barns, the occasional white wall, direct towards the sun, standing out where its windows caught the light across the valley, the high black line of the mountains and the ring of the sheep wall. You'd been reading Lawrence and you'd been reading Hardy, and just as they do, so too does Raymond Williams set his people in the landscape. It's a farmed landscape. You know, that landscape is determined by what the farmers and the shepherds do, but also even down in the valley, Harry tends his gardens.
Yeah.
They tend the gardens as a way of prefiguring what happens with the industrial scale, or the small industrial scale growing of soft fruit. It's tend and farmed land, but also in between, there's this very Welsh thing called freeth, the unfarmable land, which is dotted with rowans and occasional blackthorns and hawthorns, and it's the unfarmable land. And Williams is also a celebrant of that. And it's only when you walk a place, it's only when you walk around Caerleon that you realize that some places are still wet and rushy. And that hill that we climbed together, most people wouldn't even see it's there, because it's hidden by stepped ranks of posher houses, more expensive real estate. And then you get to somewhere and you think, oh my Lord, here's what is possibly an Iron Age hill fort, but entirely hidden out of view. So the rewards for the walker are multiple.
Yeah, and I think there's also something else in terms of you uncover the minutiae of life, and much as the car resonates, and we've also talked about fathers, and all of this is about inheritance, and it's definitely about mothers as well. And one of the things I learned from the project was I worked with Village Services, which is an organisation formed from the community in Caerleon, and they actually hosted us for that event in November 2019. And part of their remit, well, a big part of their remit is home care, and it's about working with their neighbours, and the bulk of their work now is actually about looking after the people who originally came down to Caerleon from the valleys and many other places to kind of nurture this new industry. And I think, John, you had a thought about that kind of nurturing and the actual nurturing of plants, and there was something in Border Country about the use of the dibber that connected you with all of these things.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of beautiful bits about gardening in Border Country, quite apart from the big bold brush industrial events, the unrest and so on. It's also about the joy of a man tending the earth. There was a good flower garden in front of the cottage, but the rent also included a long vegetable garden at the side of the drying green. Harry worked at this, and in the following autumn persuaded Mrs. Hibbert to rent him for £1 a year a further strip adjoining it, which he put under fruit trees, apple and pear and plum. Also, that same autumn, he was able to rent 2 strips of garden behind the timber yard at the station, and these he put down, one to gooseberries and currants, the other to potatoes. In the following spring, he bought wood and made 4 hives, which by the end of the summer, buying swarms in the valley, he had stocked with bees. The hives stood among the young fruit trees at the edge of the home vegetable garden. Then, at the end of the strip, he built a poultry run, which would be Ellen's work. And of course, the poultry and deceiving the poultry and going out in the old man's raincoat so they won't be frightened by a stranger are all a part of it. But that's a little Eden that he has produced there. He's actually found, absolute contentment. And it's the fact that many of these people have found their contentment, which is about to be ruptured and taken away from them by noises off, by decisions made by politicians, is one of the points of unrest in the novel. I think for the two of us, though, knowing you and having followed your own story by going to your house as you were clearing out your father's possessions, getting to know him, if you like, through your writing and your own thinking. This book, Border Country, is at its heart a book about a father and son's reconciliation and about their relationship to each other. I am the son of a railwayman. I, like Matthew, I went to university away and studied with Raymond Williams. And I remember that moment when we were told, you're going down to Jesus to do drama in Raymond Williams's rooms. And even the dons at Cambridge were reverential towards Raymond Williams because they knew that he was that significant a thinker. But for me, of course, I read Border Country ironically because I didn't get on with my father. In fact, I categorically did not get on with him. But it was a privilege and a rare glimpse of the companionship that can happen between father and son. And then the very deep companionship that happened with you because you decided to park your studies to be with your father, which wasn't just about looking after him, but it was also a chance for both of you to explore the two sides, the two dimensions to the story of that very particular relationship, father to son, son to father. And for you, therefore, Border Country has, I think, a totally different significance. I think you read it unutterably differently to myself. I read it as a celebration of landscape. He's a celebrant of the landscapes around Pandy and the Black Mountains and in the shadow of Haybluff and so on. But for you also, at its core, it is about this negotiation. It's about coming home, opening yourself up to say, how much of me comes from him and how much of me is just stuff I made, nature versus nurture?
Yeah, I mean, I also don't know, I don't know much about the relationship between Raymond Williams and his father, and maybe that's something could research a little bit more, but certainly my own kind of story was about exploring a little bit the relationship between me and my father after he died, and I think the kind of the creative use of English language and literature in what was essentially a social science PhD was a risk, sure, and it took some management in order to actually to get to make something presentable. But yeah, so for me, it was kind of showing that sort of being a little bit vulnerable, and every interview was about being vulnerable, because I was also kind of thinking about the place that I came from, and people talked about loss of their loved ones and their parents, and it was still quite raw for me, because this was a time when I was processing the house that I grew up in and letting go of lots of objects and memories and books and all sorts of things. And for example, selling the cars that have been so dear to my father. But at the same time, it helps to really understand that time and place, that kind of the aesthetic of that post-war era. And I think Border Country helped me to understand the story of South Wales before I was born, and helped me to understand the kind of the place that had been created. And certainly in the 80s and the 90s, there was still a fairly strong steel culture in Newport, definitely strong male dominated rather than led, kind of slightly aggressive, fighty sort of physical culture in Newport, which in the last 20 years has definitely been changed. And yeah, it was the shell lorries as well, and the movement of that material from the valley to the coast it did remind me just how much effort was put into making all that happen. And it really, in some ways, it was actually about kind of taking care of the community. It was about helping people to find new jobs and employment. And so the two things come together, the kind of the roughness and the sheer physical exertion, and also the desire to actually help people have a sustainable life. And the kind of what Morega did with the shale lorries, it did help people to remember that time of upheaval, and that time of, it was visceral. It really, people really did go back into their bodies to remember, that lots of people died actually in road accidents. And there's also there's a community organisation in Newport on Corporation Road called Community House, Eaton Road Community House, which got rebuilt in the 60s because the foundations of the church have been shaken to the ground by the shale lorries all going through Newport. So that it's definitely, I commend the structured feeling approach as the fundamentals being movement, and the fundamentals of trying to understand feeling, rather than writing some kind of official sort of history. You have to look at things which are maybe not quite so obvious, but they do kind of capture that time and place. And effectively what it's done in my personal journey is led me more firmly into human geography. And actually, thankfully, I've got the chance, starting on October the 1st, to do a postdoc fellowship at Swansea, which is about pursuing that post-war dream in a bit more detail. And I'll have the chance to work with some more performance artists and to make some more film, which is about sort of understanding what that time means for people who are now over 65. And I'm pretty convinced that there were, as time goes on, there were significant things that we forget, significant things which changed our lives, much as the pandemic will have massively changed the lives of people who are maybe teenagers or in their 20s right now. The shale lorries, the private motor car, the semi-detached house on a suburban housing estate, and there's more. One of the other beautiful things that came from the event in 2019 was a man who talked about how the fridge freezer, the chest freezer, changed life completely, and how having a chest freezer in the garage meant that his mother only had to buy big slabs of meat 4 times a year rather than him going on an errand to the butcher's a couple of times a week. So these small kind of mundane things actually are super significant, because they all add up to cultural change. And like John was talking about, growing vegetables on a small plot and having bees, which is, you know, really well captured in border country. You know, that's how people that's how people survived. You know, Harry supplemented his work as a signalman doing that job, and so the chest freezer is, when you look at it again, and when you look at the car alongside the chest freezer and add all of these things up, it does explain how these little innovations and ruptures in the way that we live lives actually are very significant, and to use a creative way of helping people to unveil these stories is the thing. I think it's something we should all think about a lot more. And yeah, and definitely Raymond Williams's work massively inspired me, alongside people, yeah, like Hardy, and definitely, you know, with John's guidance and John's belief